Welcome to Too True Philosophy. I'm your host, the Thinking Man. People see it at the supermarket, when their utility bills keep rising, or while paying for the things they enjoy in life. But what causes the cost of living to become a crisis? And is it too true to handle that this can be caused by socialism?
Caused by socialism? Oh, I can't wait to hear this.
No doubt you'll have some things to say, angry man. Let's start with the socialist argument for a rising cost of living. To understand this, we need to look at what socialists think about how markets affect prices. As I've previously explored on this channel, socialists believe the government is just as efficient as the private sector when creating growth in the economy, and that the private sector is often a hindrance to quality of life. But as I've shown previously, the public sector cannot create growth because it divides and subtracts wealth taken from the private sector. That doesn't mean the public sector has no role to play in economic growth, but without a strong private sector, the government has nothing to tax when funding socialist policies. At the heart of socialism is one theory that's essential for understanding how socialists truly think about the cost of living, even when they accept some private sector involvement in the market. This is known as the labor theory of value. The theory holds that labor is the primary or only thing that really matters. In other words, it's a fair wage for labor that counts, not the price you pay for an economic exchange.
Yes, because otherwise prices are set by greedy capitalists that take advantage of how desperate people are to make a living, or get hold of things they need to survive, like food, clothing, and shelter.
The problem with this theory, angry man, is that it assumes prices and labor are independent of other parts of an economy. And if we compare the socialist argument with classical economic theory, we see why. In classical economics, we have three key components that establish price: scarcity, competition, and self-interest. Scarcity is separated into two parts, the first being supply. Supply is, simply put, the availability of a certain product or service within an economy. Lower availability creates higher prices, whereas higher availability creates lower prices. The second part is demand, or how much pressure is put on supply by consumers of goods and services. Competition is the next thing that affects prices, as competitively lowering prices is attractive to consumers. The self-interest part of classical economics is the most subjective and makes the case for how people ultimately act on their desires when buying and selling. One may ask what stops people from being unethical if all that matters is something as selfish as self-interest. But economics isn't necessarily the same as moral philosophy. Despite this, however, classical economics shows us how prices work in the real world, since prices are dictated not by labor, but by scarcity and competition in a market.
Wait, are you actually admitting that capitalists don't care about morality?
I'm merely pointing out that there's a difference between economics and moral philosophy, though this is not relevant for this video because I'm demonstrating that prices are set by scarcity and competition, not by right or wrong.
Even if that were true, you still haven't shown that the rising cost of living is caused by socialism.
That's because I think it's important to initially show the key difference between the labor theory of value and classical economics before drawing any conclusions. To be fair to socialists, I'm not arguing that rising prices cannot happen in a free market economy. Clearly, this is not the case if supply is lower and demand is higher. But equally, a lack of competition will affect prices, and this is where socialism can cause many problems. Socialists see no issue with reducing competition through government or public ownership, sometimes called nationalization. This reduces competition in a market, which then creates an upward trajectory on prices. Naturally, socialists will deny this by stating that the government or state creates economic growth when it spends taxation. Often this involves using infrastructure spending to artificially boost growth in the economy, including roads, bridges, street lighting, sanitation, or other infrastructure essential for a functioning society. While this doesn't create growth in itself, it does facilitate a system that allows people to go about their daily lives. This is why most will agree that spending taxation on common essential infrastructure is the best use of this revenue, since it makes society possible. This goes for police, military, courts, or prisons that make law and order possible. These things are relatively cheap when funded through common taxation. Far more expensive are large welfare programs that take up a huge proportion of government spending. Nationalized industries also take up a great deal of government spending, yet they're far less efficient because market signals can't operate properly under socialism. This is why the history of socialism is riddled with supply shortages, and unless the market is allowed to enter an economy, they can lead to catastrophic outcomes like food famines and energy blackouts.
Socialism isn't responsible for this. If the whole world was socialist, then we could avoid these problems by sharing our resources. If it weren't for capitalists that hoard their wealth and resources from the rest of us, there'd be more than enough to go round.
And here we see that, in the end, socialism is utopian, because unless socialists control everything in society, they cannot achieve the perfect system they promote. What's more, if you stand in their way, you'll be harshly treated. The reality is, however, that even if socialists did control the whole world, the same problems would occur again and again because the market is the only way that nature can allocate a limited number of resources. Equally, the market encourages people to spend time and money creating goods and services. The farmer that grows crops and rears animals, the shopkeeper that sells us goods, or the inventor that creates an electronic device that entertains us or improves the efficiency of our everyday lives. None of these can last under a fully socialist economy, and this is why the only way any kind of socialism can exist is within a free market economy where government spending is primarily based on critical infrastructure and law and order. Socialist programs can exist if they're capped at a level that doesn't lead to rising taxation and government debt. But these are never compromises that socialists are prepared to make indefinitely, using cries of inequality and poverty to justify taking so much wealth from productive individuals and sectors of the economy that people gradually slow their economic activity. The other casualty of rising socialism is growing government debt and price inflation. Government debt is the easiest to explain because, as economic growth is affected by rising taxes and the expense of increasing regulations, the government is forced to borrow to continue funding socialist programs. But like any other borrowing, if you can't keep up with repayments, your debt will rise to the point that it takes up an unsustainable portion of your revenue. Government central banks printing money often follows, which does encourage some early growth, but at the cost of rising prices through inflation.
Nonsense! Money is an imaginary concept that has no basis in the real world. We could decide prices if only capitalists didn't interfere by protecting their own interests.
Actually, while money is a concept, it's also a useful means to participate in an economy without having to rely on bartering. In this sense, it's very useful, but if we're forced to peg prices to a certain currency and the supply of that currency is increased, this is the equivalent of continuing to slice a pizza into smaller pieces. Obviously, this will mean that each slice of the pizza will get smaller, in the same way as printing money reduces the value of the currency we all have, which creates inflation.
No! Money printing doesn't cause inflation. These myths stand in the way of a cashless society, where resources can be fairly allocated and capitalist control is abolished.
I'm sorry this is too true to handle, angry man, but my arguments show that, while there is room for an economy that has some socialist programs, no amount of government spending can ever create true economic growth. This is why socialism does cause a cost of living crisis when the percentage of government spending rises too high for taxation to keep up with. In the end, socialism is so incapable of creating sustainable economic growth that countries blessed by natural resources still can't create prosperity with high taxation and regulation. This explains how countries like Venezuela are still poor, despite bountiful supplies of oil and gas. This also explains why countries like Norway use oil and gas revenue to fund large socialist programs while avoiding taxation and regulation levels that cause economic collapse. So I must conclude that socialists need to accept that they cannot endlessly blame the problems of their economic policies on capitalism because, without a strong private sector, socialism causes a cost of living crisis. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe.